Hello everyone. So today we are going to understand the low-level design of a URL shortener. So we will discuss how to approach this question if this question comes up in an interview. What all steps, what all is the expectation for such type of questions coming in the low-level design rounds. Basically, in some of the companies, they are also termed as machine coding round, where the expectation from the candidate is that they explain what is the functional requirement, non-functional requirements, what is like the entire flow in the system. Uh, they have to also explain the UML diagram, the class diagram, the interactions, and all the relationships between the classes, and also have to implement that code. And the expectation is that the code is runnable. And this is how this type of interview rounds look like. So let's deep dive into it. So, what could be the functional requirement for such a system? So, the first requirement would be to generate a unique short URL for a given long URL. And once we have that short URL generated, so whenever user goes and tries to paste or in the any of the browser, it should get redirected to that original website, like whatever the short URL we have generated from the long URL, it should get redirected. So redirect users to the original long URL when the short URL is accessed. So this is the basic requirement for this system, and hence we have termed it as functional requirements. There could be other requirements as well in the system, but this is again like before starting into the design of the system. You should definitely have the interaction with the interviewer, like what is the expectation, and if there is some specific requirements the interviewer is expecting, then we need to have that into our functional requirement as well. So, like the major point of view is like to have a discussion with your interviewer so that both you and your interviewer are on the same page before starting the design. And what could be the non-functional requirements of the system? So first thing is like each short URL must be unique across the system. We want to make sure that whatever short URL we are generating is unique for any particular long URL which is getting into like whatever a user is providing. And the design should be flexible enough to support future enhancements. We'll see this in our like whenever we understand the UML diagram, class diagrams, and the code. We'll see how we are making this design more flexible. Code should follow object-oriented principles. Definitely, this should be the key. Like we want to design a system which is extensible and flexible enough, and clean abstraction, clear separation of concerns. Right, this 2 point will be better understood when we have a code walkthrough and the UML diagram or the design part of it. This 2 points will be more clear at that point of time. So these are the functional and the non-functional requirements of our system. So this, whenever you are in the interview, if you get a question like design a URL shortener uh, service or an application, this is the basic requirement of the system, which you can put on your paper and start discussing whether a interviewer has any other requirements or any other expectation from the candidate. Once that is sorted off, we can go ahead in the design part. So, if you are not aware about what is actually this service or the application, so in there are many open source services which like takes in the long URL here, and it has a domain specified, which is nothing but whenever a domain is nothing but https colon slash slash and whatever dot com slash whatever is there, like first that much is the domain. So here the domain would be https colon slash slash tinyurl.com and slash whatever the uh, shortened URL will get. So basically this application works in a way like we provide the long URL. So user provides a long URL, and we can also have this functionality into our system if expected. This is completely optional. If we want to give any alias, like user wants to specify any alias, and then if they'll hit this button shorten link, so basically in our system how it would work is it will trigger an API which is like shortening of the URL, and it will return the shortened URL. as an output. So this is how the interface would look like. Okay, now let's understand the class diagram. So first thing is we will go ahead and see each of the classes, their relationships, like what how each of the classes are related to each other, and then we will try to mimic that into our code. So basically, in any of the low-level design interviews or any of the low-level design rounds, what I feel is if you are having a better clarity about what all classes will be involved, what all objects will be involved in your system, and how is the interaction happening, how is the data flow happening in the system, the coding part won't take that much time. So it's basically if you are clear with your design part, the low level design, which is nothing but sketching out the classes and their relationships, the code part becomes very easy. Why I say this is like you're just like you're just making that entire whatever diagram portion you have worked on into a code. The only thing would be there involved is your logic implementation. Let's say in this case we are shortening the URL, so that logic implementation would be the key there, right? You will get the skeleton of your code if you have a better understanding about the class diagrams and the UML diagrams for such systems. So let's pick each and every class, and let's after that, once we have the clarity about it, we'll see the implementation as well. So first thing is like in our system, as we saw that we are as a user will be providing a long URL, and we will be providing back the shortened URL, right? So basically we would require something which like keeps information of long URL, short URL, and its created time. So here we'll have the shorten URL class, which will have the attributes as long URL of type string, short URL, and the creation time, right? And these are nothing but the getters of this particular attributes. Like this all will be private into our class. So if you want to access it from outside this class, we'll have a public method get long URL, which will return this long URL, and similarly for the short URL and the creation date and time. Now, like before going into the depth of the design patterns and all, first let's see what all classes we will be having and what all interfaces we'll be having into our system. So now once we have this basic class of holding the information of long and the short URL, now here we are not having any third party integration of the database where we'll be storing this basically the corresponding mapping of the short URL to the long URL, right? So we'll try to have everything here in memory. This might not be practically implemented in the large scale systems, definitely, but this is like for a very small scale system you can consider, because this is what we are just for the learning purpose we are considering it as an in-memory storage, right? So for that, first thing what we will be requiring is like we would need some kind of mapping in a way, right? For a particular short URL, we have corresponding long URL. And even the vice versa, that for a particular long URL, we'll have a short URL as well, right? So for that purpose, we will have an interface, URL repository. So what is its responsibility of this interface, right? So it will have the methods like save URL. So what is save URL? So as I mentioned that we would need some metrics where we could save that for this particular for this particular short URL, what is the corresponding long URL, right? So for that purpose, we'll invoke this function. The input to this function would be the shortened URL. And find by key is nothing but if you want to get the long URL for the corresponding short URL, we can pass the key as a short URL here and can get the corresponding long URL. So find by key is nothing but that. Find key by long URL. So here we want a short URL for the corresponding long URL. So the input parameter here is the long URL and we'll get the corresponding short URL. Get next ID is basically used as an identity. Whenever, so see, we are making sure that our system is having a unique short URL for any of the long URL which is getting provided by the user. So when I say this, let's say a user passed in some long URL, okay, and we generated one short URL. Now, same user came back again and passed in the same URL. So now we are not going to generate another URL, right? We have that mapping stored. So we'll return that corresponding short URL again if that same URL is getting pasted for that particular uh, long to short URL, right? And let's say some other user came in and pasted some new long URL. So we'll correspondingly map a short URL for it and we'll return back to the user. So here the key part is we are generating unique short URL for every long URL. So how could we generate? So here we have domain as fixed, right? The domain is nothing but https colon slash colon slash tinyurl.com is our domain or whatever could be your domain, right? So that is fixed. Now, anything after that should be unique, right? So there are various methods to generate that unique identifier. So for that purpose, we'll be using this get next ID. You'll see this in the code implementation. It will be very clear, but you can just understand that this functionality would be used there, right? Exist by key is nothing but we are checking that whether key is nothing but our short URL, right, which is getting passed into our parameter of this function, is this key already existing or not. So it's a Boolean type of function. It will return true if the key exists and false if the key does not exist. So as I mentioned that this is an interface. So we will be having a class in memory URL repository, which will be implementing this interface. And its responsibility of this class would be to implement all of this methods defined, right? And as I mentioned that we would need some storage where we map a key is nothing but a short URL to the corresponding long URL and along the short URL. And this ID counter is basically to get this next unique identifier, right? So this function would be using this parameter ID counter, which is the get next ID. That will be like we'll see this how it is getting used in the code, but you can understand right now is that this is the ID counter, which is uh, identify a counter basically. And so key to URL map will be storing a string is nothing but the key, which is the short URL and the shortened URL. So we are here the value is nothing but this complete object instance of this object is getting stored here so that we can get both the information of long short URL and its time later. Long URL to the short URL map will be storing. Here the key would be the long URL and the value would be the short URL. This is the ID counter which I told you. Now this is about the storage part. Now let's see how this short unique URL is getting generated. Like domain part is fixed and now how that the next after slash the portion gets generated uniquely, right? So for that purpose, we are having an interface. Uh, like we have named this interface as short URL generation strategy. And this interface will have one function which is generate short URL and it will give us like return type will be string, the generated short URL and the input parameter to this function would be an long ID. Now this ID basically is nothing but this ID counter, right? Which we have defined here. So in this interface, uh, we have defined two strategies of using this. So basically, the first strategy is random generation strategy, and the second is base62 generation strategy. So in random generation strategy, we'll see this detail in our code, but you can just right now understand that we are generating that unique identifier for our short URL by two strategies. One is random generation and one is base62 generation. And it will have these two attributes, basically the character string and the random uh, instance of the random class. And as I mentioned, this is an interface both of this class, the concrete implementation's responsibility would be to define this logic of how to generate the short URL for the particular value of the input parameter ID getting passed to the function. Right. And in this base62 generation strategy also will have this all its attributes like base62 character string. Base is nothing but this value will be 62 and this long min 6 characters ID offset will be the minimum value in like 6-digit minimum value, right? And so this is about the generation of the unique identifier for our particular short URL. Now, let's see. Okay, so now we have defined how we are storing it. What is our basic, how we are storing is nothing but in memory storage, right? And how we are keeping the information about the long URL, short URL, and its creation time in this class, like in the instance of this class, and the generation strategy about the short URL, right? And now, how would we like bring all this together? Let's see this. So we are having one orchestrator in our system, which is the URL Shortener Service. So what would be the responsibility of this class? So basically, this class will hold an instance of URL repository. So all the generation of the URL saving and all this will happen through this instance, URL repository instance. We'll also hold the strategy, right? Like how we want to generate that unique identifier using the random generation strategy or base62 generation strategy, which we have right now in our system. Domain is nothing but this will be the fixed constant value. And max retries would be like, let's say we are trying to generate the short URL, like how many repetitive, let's say we are not able to find the unique identifier. Like we have mapped all of the we have exhausted of the IDs, the unique IDs which we have, and now we are not left with any unique identifier for our corresponding for a corresponding short URL for a long URL. So in that we have defined this max retry. So after that many retries, it will throw an error that could not find the unique short URL. But this is rarest of the case. And this is nothing but the initialization part here in this. These are all the functions of this service URL shortener service class. Initialization is nothing but initializing the domain value, the URL repository instance, and the generation strategy, like what generation strategy you want to choose. Shorten URL's responsibility would be to get the short URL for the corresponding long URL, which I showed in the image previously. Like whenever I hit that shorten link button, this API would get called at the backend of our, like in our back, basically, which will have input as long URL, and its responsibility would be to get the short URL for the corresponding long URL, right? And this get long URL from the short URL is nothing but the resolution part, you can say, like whenever you have provided that particular redirect functionality, right? The second functional requirement which we had, this one, that redirecting the user to the original long URL when the short URL is exist, right? So for that purpose, this function would take care of that, that when we give in the long URL, it will resolve corresponding, sorry, when it will give short URL, it will resolve its corresponding long URL. This get instance is nothing but we have made this class as a singleton class. We don't want that every user coming to our application server goes on and create multiple instances of URL shortener service, right? We don't want to exhaust our heap memory in just creation of the objects. And hence we have made this as a singleton class. So get instance will return the instance of this shortened URL. So once the instance get created into our system, that single instance would be used to access, like it would be the single entry point into our system. You can consider it that way. If any other call is coming for the creation, it will return that same instance. It won't go ahead and resolve some new heap memory space. Basically, if you understand in that fashion. So here we are using the instance of, we are using the URL repository and the short URL generation strategy instances. So it's like we are having a composition relationship between both of this, right? Because we are making sure that we would need this into our URL shortener service class. So this is at like this has a composition relationship with these two classes. And as this are two interfaces, the concrete implementation implements this, right? And the shortened URL is getting used in this URL repository. Basically, we are making use, like we are storing it. So it is again a composition relationship there. And okay, one part here is like we are also making sure that whenever we are creating an object of the shortened URL, we are using a builder pattern, right? If you are not aware like how builder pattern works, I have created a detailed video about how the builder pattern works with example. So you can go and check that out in my channel. And I also drop a link in the description for the same. You can check it out from there as well. So basically, we are trying to make sure that we are creating the object of this class using a builder pattern, right? And hence, I think we are almost done with defining the relationship between the classes, what is the functionality and responsibility of each class. And this is nothing but the main through which we will be uh, calling our shorten here. So to client, main is nothing but to client will be exposing this API itself, right? That would be the functionality that would be exposed to the client, right? So also we with others, okay, so we'll see uh, the code implementation now. And I'll also keep this diagram side by side on the right hand side panel and code on the left hand side panel so that it's better to understand. Cool. So first we'll understand this URL shortener, shorten URL class. So as I mentioned that we are creating the object of this class using the builder pattern. So all of these attributes which I mentioned here, I've used this. So this implementation is in Java. So just to be clear, uh, we have this long URL, short URL, and its creation time. And this is the builder pattern which we have implemented. I'm not going into the details of how the builder pattern is working here, but to understand it, you can check my previous video of builder pattern on my channel. There I've explained in detail, taking an example how it is working. Just to give you an overview here. So whenever we are creating any object using the builder pattern, we make sure two things. First thing is we identify the mandatory parameters and the optional parameters. So here the mandatory parameter for us is long URL and the short URL, and local date time, like creation time, is not mandatory for us, right? So how we make sure is, let's say the aim is to create an object of type shorten URL, right? So we don't invoke this constructor. So we make this as private if you see here, right? We won't be able to invoke it outside from this class, this constructor. So what we make sure is we create public static class builder. Why static? Because we don't want to create an object of this class. So we are making this as public static, and we define the mandatory parameter in its constructor itself. So if you see here, as I mentioned, we identify two mandatory parameters which we have passed in the construction of builder, right? And the remaining optional parameter, we will write a function for each of that optional parameter. So creation date is nothing but whatever the date is getting passed at that, like whenever you're creating an object, that will be passed here and that will be set in this local date time attribute, right? And at the end, we will be calling this build method. So responsibility of build method is to return an instance of the shortened URL. The objective is to generate the instance of this shortened URL class, right? So it will be returning that. Now, if you see for all of the optional parameters, we return this. So this is nothing but an instance of the same builder, right? So as in when we are building an object by a step-by-step method, every method will be returning the instance of that same class, right? Returning this is nothing but an instance of a builder is only getting returned. And at the end, whenever we are calling dot build, so when dot build is getting called, this function gets invoked and this will return an instance of the shortened URL. And while returning an instance, it is calling it is calling its constructor, right? Which we have defined above. And the parameter passed to that constructor is the build object. Using the builder, whatever we have built right now is getting passed here. And this builder will initializes all of this values, right? So this is how the builder pattern works. And I'm just touch basing up like what is there right now in the code so that if any new person is watching this, he or she does not get overwhelmed, but to have a detailed understanding go and check that out video in my channel. I'll drop a link in the description as well. So this is about our shortened URL class, right? Now let's see this part, the store in memory storage. So here interface, as I mentioned, will be having four functions. Save URL is nothing but saving the short URL and the long URL mapping. Find by key is nothing but passing the key, which is shortened URL, will get the what is its corresponding long URL. Find key by long URL will be getting the short URL for its corresponding long URL, and the ID will be used in basically generating the unique short URL identifier. It will be used there. So this one method would be responsible there. And exist by key is nothing but checking that whether we already have that short URL into our system or not. So as I mentioned that in memory URL repository will be a concrete implementation of this URL repository. Here we will be holding three maps as discussed previously as well. Key to shorten URL. So this map will hold the key, the shorten URL as a key, and the shorten URL object, right? And that is key to URL map. Long URL to short URL map. So this map will be holding long URL as key and short URL as a value, and the ID counter, right, which will be used by this function. All of these are concurrent hash map because we don't want any issues into our multi-threaded environment. So this will take care of that. Hence, we are using concurrent hash map and the atomic long because this all are thread safe. So as I mentioned that the responsibility of the concrete class would be to implement all of this logic, right, of each functionalities defined in this interface. So save URL will be nothing but will be saving the corresponding short URL for and the URL whatever instance we have got. And long URL to short URL will be storing. Long URL is key and short URL is its value, right? Now find by key is nothing but we are making sure that if we have the key, we return its corresponding uh, instance of short URL, right? So key to URL map dot get key would be returning the instance of this basically if we have in our if we have that key present. If not, it will be returning null, right? And find key by long URL. So this will be returning corresponding short URL for a long URL. So long URL to short URL get long URL will give us the value, which is the short URL, right? And exists by key is nothing but it's checking whether we already have this key, which is the short URL in our system or not. So it's a boolean. And get next ID's responsibility would be to increment the ID counter, right? Get an increment. So this is about storage part. Now let's see the like how this key generation is happening, like how we are getting this unique short URLs, right? So let's see that. So as we have seen that this is an interface which has a function generate short URL for, I mean, its responsibility would be to generate the short URL basically and return that. Now we have two strategies here. One is random generation strategy and one is base62 generation strategy. How the random strategy works. So here we have took two attributes you can say uh, into this function. One is characters. So it's a character string of small case A to Z, uppercase A to Z, and 0 to 9, right? We have took an instance of random function, right? And how will this work? So here, if you see, like in generating using a random strategy, the basically the short URL using a random strategy, the significance of this ID is not actually there. Like we are generating. So here also we are making sure that whatever that short our short URL we are generating, we want to make sure that we bound it by 6 characters, right? We don't want to exceed above 6 characters. So first thing is we are creating a string builder of size 6, and we are trying to generate the random number. So whenever this function will get executed, it will generate any of the random index from like this character string which we have. And once we have that index, we will character dot characters dot add character at will pick that value and will append into our this builder, right? And we'll return that. Now let's see base 62 generation strategy. How this works is, so here also we have took the base 62 character string, and this is same A to Z, uppercase, lowercase, and 0 to 9. Base we have defined as 62, and this is the minimum value, right? 6-digit minimum value which we have defined. You can see this is 916,132,832 is the minimum value of 6 digit. So this is basically the maths only you can see. So if someone comes and asks you in the interview that why are you using this basics rule strategy, like how many range of numbers could you get? So as I mentioned that we are bounding our short URL by 6 characters. Each characters can have 62 unique combinations. So if you use PNC, so every place will be having 62 options. So 62 raised to, you can say that 62 raised to how many? 6 characters. 62 raised to 6 unique combinations is something your system can produce, right? It's a huge number if you calculate. So this is something which is like, it's not just implementing, you should also understand what we are doing, right? So that is about it. And this logic of generating short URL here works is like, if the ID value is 0, then we are returning the value which is at character 0, which A would be returned. And let's say the ID value is not 0, is coming up to some value. So we are creating a new ID after adding offset. So it is nothing but this minimum value plus the ID value which we got. And once we have that, if you are aware about how we generate from a number to a binary representation, if you are aware about, it's very similar to that. The only thing is here the base value is getting changed. So any of the decimal number, when it's converted to some other representation, being it's binary, it's octal or hexadecimal, it always depends on the base value, right? When it's binary, the base is 2. When it's octal, its base is 8. When it's hexadecimal, its base is 16. So whatever the base is, the conversion happens accordingly. So here the base we are choosing is 62. So it's similar way how we generate the binary representation from the decimal. The only very difference here is the base value, right? So we are first getting the modulus. We are whatever the new offset which we got, mod base, and whatever the index we will have, that will append into our builder, and we'll divide this new offset with the base. This is what we do in the binary as well, right? When you convert the decimal to binary, right? So once we have that string, we reverse it and send it off. So this is about the base 62 generation strategy. Now let's see our main class, which is the orchestrator of our complete system, which is the URL shortener service, right? Okay. As I mentioned that we want to make sure that we just have a single instance into our system. We don't want multiple client or the user coming to our system and generating multiple instances. So here we are implementing the singleton design pattern. And so for a singleton design pattern, we make sure that we make the constructor as private. Why? Because if the constructor is private, definitely it won't generate an instance, right? If someone comes and calls URL shortener service is equals to new URL shortener service, right? So for that purpose, we did that. And we'll create get instance method, which will be public static. And why? Because we want to access it from outside this class, and we want to make sure that we return the single instance of the system which will have the control over the entire system. So we'll first check here is if instance is null. So this basically is this instance of type URL shortener service is null, and we'll create and we'll store it. If it's not, we'll return that. Right. So this method will make sure that only a single instance is getting returned. So now, as I also previously discussed, that we'll have an instance of URL repository and this URL shorten URL generation strategy and the domain and the max retries. The initializing all this will be nothing but will initialize the domain part, URL repository, and which strategy we want to use to generate that short URL. So that will be handled in this function, right? So it's nothing but whatever we are calling it from main will get like initialize in all of these three attributes. And what is the shorten URL? So this is our main API. So a particular long URL will generate the shorten URL. So first thing will be we will try to find like uh, that whether for this particular long URL we have got request in past or not, right? So URL repository has that function find key by long URL. So we'll try to call that passing the long URL, and we'll check that whether we have got uh, this request previously as well. So if it would be, then we would get this, I mean, the value would be returned, right, from this function. If it is not, it will return null. So if short URL is present, if it is there, then uh, like we will return directly. So like this check is for if we already have got the request for that particular long URL. We don't want to generate again, right? So we'll just return the domain and the short URL which we got. If not, then we will have to create. So generate short URL function will take care of creation. How this is working is we are making sure that whatever the generation strategy which we have defined, right, we'll try to uh, generate it. So I also mentioned that so if you remember this generate short URL was taking one of the input parameter as ID here, if you see, right? So this ID is nothing but coming from the repository get next ID, right? So this will make sure that every time that function is getting called, that ID gets incremented and that value gets passed, right? So it's like understand it in this way. Whenever a user comes to our system, right, it will give it a long URL. And first check would be whether this long URL exists or not, right? If this long URL exists, we will return directly that long URL, and we won't be uh, generating a short URL for this corresponding long URL. If not, then we'll hit the line 36. Then we would have to generate a short URL, right? For that purpose, we'll be calling based on whatever the strategy which we have initialized in this initialize method, being it random or the base62. That strategy dot generate short URL will be called. So basically, let's say we have said base62. So this method would get invoked, and this long ID would be this coming from the get next ID, which is defined in the URL repository. So whenever there are, let's say, 5 users, user one came and it called, right? The URL was not long URL did not exist into our anytime into our system. So for that, a corresponding short URL got generated and the value passed here was 1. The next user came in. Same case, not present in our system, like corresponding long URL, short URL mapping went here, and here the value will get passed as 2. Simple, right? So that is how it will work. Once we have that short URL, we'll check that whether this exists or not. Like there might be a case, right? In random generation strategy, we might get the same random string return, right? Or in the base62 also, we might get that is like rarest of the case, but that is a possibility that we could get same short URL, right, or different to long URLs. So we don't want to run with that issue. So first we are checking that whether it exists or not. So if it does not exist, so which means that we got a unique short URL and will return. And we'll keep trying this for max retries which we have defined, right? So let's say for 10 times we tried this, calling this function generate short URL, and we could not find any of the unique URL, right? And we'll return an exception that failed to generate a unique short key after this many retry attempts, right? And so this is how we'll get this new short URL. Once we have that new short URL, we will build our short URL instance. So here builder pattern comes into picture. You see, we are creating this one, right? We are creating this short URL using this builder. So new short URL dot builder. What does this call? New short URL dot builder will call this. Let me show you that. So new short URL dot builder calls this constructor, right? And after that, good. So this will be uh, returning an instance of builder itself, right? Because this is a constructor, it returns an instance of its own type. And once we have that, we'll call build. So build's functionality, if you remember, was to this is was to return this short URL, which is the aim of like creating this short URL. And this is the instance which is getting passed, like builded instance. So we are not calling this creation date time. So that will be not getting set right now, right? So these two are getting set, and that will be set into our instance and will return that particular new short URL, right? So this is how builder is getting used. So you have not called the optional parameter explicitly here, but you can if you want. And once we have that shorten URL object returned, we will save it, right? So in URL repository, if you remember, we had two maps. One is like key, which is the shortened URL, and the which will be storing that instance, and hence the other map which will have long URL, the short URL mapping. So we'll save that. So this activity will take place in by calling this function save URL in the URL repository, and finally, once we have saved that, we'll return. Right? Returning is nothing but a domain plus the new short URL which we got. So this short URL is nothing but an identifier of 6-digit. You can understand it this way. When I'll run it from me, we'll get it. And the second functional requirement was to resolve. Like whenever a short URL is getting passed by the user, it should get redirected to the correct long URL. So for that purpose, we have this functionality, which is get long URL from the short URL, right? This one, and that will basically first check for a particular short URL, like is that the correct short URL which got created from our application or not. So first it will check that whether it starts with the domain which we have. If it is not, it will return an empty. If it is, like this check passes through, it will replace the domain part with blank, because we want to now see that whether this key already exists or not. So let's say URL repository dot uh, exist by key will check. So once this check is returning us true, we will get that shortened URL instance which we have in this map, basically key to URL map. Once we get that, we return that, right? Like once we get that instance, we return the long URL, like get long URL from that instance will return me the long URL. If I'm not able to find, which means that we never generated this shortened key, so it will return this optional dot empty, right? And now let's see by running this from main. Okay, so expand this all. Change the command font. Okay. Okay. When I run this, So first thing is we are like getting an instance of our URL Shortener service, which is our orchestrator to call the APIs exposed out there. Initializing is nothing but we are passing in the domain, we are passing in the storage, how we are doing it, and we are making sure that right now we have passed as random generation strategy, right? As an generation strategy for short URL. So once we have that, we gave this string long URL, I mean original URL, which the user will come and pass into our system. So for that, uh, shortening this long URL. So we want to shorten this long URL that gets printed out into our console. And then we call this a service shorten URL, which is this one, the service, which is this shorten URL, right? By passing that long URL as an argument, and we get the generated short URL. So this is the generated short URL using random, you can say, generation strategy. So as I was always mentioning, that domain part remains same, right? We are generating this six length character string using the random generation strategy. So this is our complete short URL, right? And like when we want to test that if we are passing this short URL, what it is corresponding long URL it is uh, returning. So we are resolving. So here we are calling that second function get long URL from the short URL, which is this one, right? This one, and we are passing that short URL which we got in this step, and we are seeing that, and it is returning that same long URL which I had shortened, right? You can also change here the generation strategy to base 62 generation strategy, and you can also see how it works. So let's file. Okay, so here using this base 62 generation strategy, it generated me this basically the shortened URL, right? The domain part remains the same. This is a 6-digit shortened URL because we have make sure that we want 6-digit, not 6 digit, 6 character length shortened URL, right? You can make it 7 up to your choice, but this is what we have gone ahead with. And resolve part also remains the same. So I think this is about the implementation part about this URL shortener service. It is very basic, very easy to start with. Now let's understand the design patterns which we have used in building up this URL shortener service. Let's understand from the class diagram itself the design patterns used. So here we are making sure that uh, uh, we are using first thing is builder pattern as I explained for generating or creating the object of this class. So one is the builder pattern. The other one is the strategy design pattern. How? So strategy design pattern is, let's say in future we got some another way of generating the short URL. We have to just implement this interface and define the concrete implementation of that class and the logic of generating the short URL, right? Also for storage, here we are doing in-memory storage. Let's say in future we got some other requirement of storing that information of our short URL to long URL mappings. So in that case as well, we just have to define the concrete implementation of that new class and have to define this functions there. So basically we have made sure that we are using builder and strategy pattern here into our system to make our code flexible, extensible in the future. Each of this concrete implementation have their separate concerns. Like we are making sure that it is following the single responsibility principle as well. Our code is open for extension and closed for modifications. So I think we are also following the design patterns into design principles, sorry, not patterns, design patterns and the principles into our uh, low level design of URL shortener service. So I think this was about it. So we have defined and defined the functional and non-functional requirements we have satisfied into our system. and we have made sure that we make our system more and more flexible, easy to understand, and extensible in the future. So, following design principles and so design patterns as well. So, I think this was about it. So, in the interview as well, if this question comes up, this is the design it looks like for the functional and the non-functional requirements discussed previously. So let's say in future, if the interviewer's expectation is like you also give us the statistics, like the analytics, that how many times a particular short URL is getting accessed. So for this purpose, you need to have something into our system. Like we would need to have some implementation of the class which will make sure that which will count the number of times that URL is getting accessed, right? So this could be one of the extension to this problem. You can try that out. If you want me to have that also, I can make a video, separate video for the same. But for now, I'll keep this up to the basic design and the required design, right? So yeah, that's all for it. I hope you liked the content. If you liked it, do like, share, and subscribe, and follow for more for some interesting new content. Till then, bye bye, take care, and have a nice day.